Forget what you think you know about World War I. 2 shots that killed 17 million. That was the story of how the war began with a teenager's pistol in Sarajevo. But what followed was not fought in parliaments or palaces, it was fought in mud, blood, and fear. Welcome back to Reality of Battlefields and our series Untold War Stories. I'm your host, and today we step into the world where the war was truly fought, the trenches. This is not a story of generals and gilded halls. It is the story of ordinary men farmers, clerks, and school teachers, transformed into soldiers who lived, suffered, and died in a nightmare landscape that came to define the Great War. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. on a cold November morning in 1916. Somewhere in the muddy fields of northern France, a 19-year-old soldier sits with his back pressed against the earthen wall of a World War I trench. We'll call him Tommy Nain, that represented thousands of British soldiers during the Great War. Tommy's hands shake as he tries to light a cigarette. Not from the cold, though the air is freezing. Not from fear, though his heart pounds. His hands shake because for 6 months, he has lived in trench warfare, a new kind of conflict that changed military history forever. Tommy doesn't know that in 3 hours, when the whistle blows for another offensive, he will become part of the WWI soldier stories that we're sharing today. He doesn't know that his mother is writing him a letter that may never reach him. But Tommy does know this. He is no longer the farm boy who left home. Life in the trenches has changed him forever. This is their story. The story of Tommy Peer. And Hans representing the millions of soldiers whose experiences shaped our understanding of World War I trench life. August 1914. Picture the streets of London, Paris, Berlin filled with young men marching to war, believing they'd be home by Christmas. This optimism would soon meet the reality of modern military technology. Kaiser Wilhelm II watched his soldiers march beneath banners reading Gott mit uns, God with us. Military leaders believed this would be a war of movement, of traditional cavalry charges and quick victories. In Paris, General Joseph Joffre studied his maps with confidence. His strategy was straightforward. Attack with such determination that enemy forces would retreat within weeks. But then came September 1914 and the First Battle of the Marne. Advanced military technology, machine guns, artillery, and defensive positions stopped the German advance toward Paris. When neither side could break through, both armies began digging protective positions. What started as temporary shelters evolved into elaborate trench systems, stretching 475 miles across Europe from Switzerland to the North Sea. This marked the birth of trench warfare, not from grand strategy, but from the necessity of survival against modern weapons. Close your eyes and imagine you're Private James Robertson from Scotland, arriving at the Western Front in spring 1915. You're 19, never traveled far from home, and nothing could prepare you for what you're about to see. As you approach the front lines, the landscape transforms. Trees disappear, not cut down, but destroyed by months of artillery bombardment. Grass vanishes, replaced by churned earth that makes walking difficult. Then you smell it. Veterans describe it as unforgettable, the mixture of cordite, mud, and human presence that defined no man's land. You reach a hill and see the Western Front. 2 lines of trenches facing each other across a wasteland that was once productive farmland. This area between the trenches, scattered with obstacles and unexploded ordnance, became the most dangerous territory in military history. Welcome to your new home, Private Robertson. This trench warfare environment will define military strategy for the next 4 years. Let me describe what Tommy's trench looked like during a typical day in 1916. The trench measured approximately 7 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Barely enough space for 2 soldiers to pass. Walls were reinforced with wooden planks and sandbags, though constant rain turned everything into thick mud that seemed to grab your equipment. The trench floor had wooden walkways called duckboards, but most were damaged or submerged. Soldiers often stood in knee-deep water that was part rainwater, part mud. Above, stretched across the trench, was protective covering against artillery fragments, canvas and metal that blocked much of the sky. For months, soldiers rarely saw direct sunlight. The constant sounds included rifle fire, artillery bombardments, and machine guns. This was the audio landscape of World War I trench warfare, a conflict that never truly paused. Tommy shared his trench environment with creatures that thrived in these conditions. The rats were remarkable in size, some as large as house cats, well fed from the abundant food sources available on battlefields. They showed no fear of humans and had adapted completely to trench life. Soldiers also dealt with lice infestations in clothing and equipment. These parasites spread trench fever, an illness causing high temperatures and weakness that could last for weeks. The most feared challenge was poison gas. First used extensively during the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. This represented a new form of warfare that affected soldiers' respiratory systems and required new protective measures. Picture April 22, 1915. During the Second Battle of Ypres, a Canadian soldier named Private John McCrae witnessed something that would influence his famous poetry. A yellowish-green cloud moved slowly across the battlefield like morning fog. When Allied soldiers first saw this unusual mist, they were curious. Then they began experiencing respiratory difficulties, as the chlorine gas affected their breathing and caused fluid in their lungs. McCrae observed soldiers struggling with the effects, unable to breathe properly. Survivors often experience permanent respiratory damage and voice changes. Later in the war, both sides developed more sophisticated chemical weapons. Mustard gas didn't cause immediate effects. Instead, it caused chemical burns to skin, eyes, and respiratory systems that developed over time. This evolution represented how WWI warfare had changed from traditional combat to industrial scale. Conflict using chemistry and technology. In quiet moments between battles, soldiers found ways to maintain their humanity and document their experiences for future generations. Let me share their authentic words, not sanitized versions, but real accounts of World War I soldier experiences. Wilfred Owen, a British officer and poet, wrote to his mother from his position in 1917. "Dearest Mother, I cannot fully describe our living conditions, as the censors restrict such information. The challenges here are beyond what civilian life could prepare anyone for. We face difficulties that test every aspect of human endurance, yet we continue to support each other through these trials." From German positions, a young soldier named Private Heinrich Boll wrote, "We have become different people than when we arrived. The experience changes your perspective on everything, on survival, on friendship, on what matters most in life. Yesterday, I helped carry an injured comrade to safety, and I realized that in these conditions, helping others helps you maintain your own humanity." French soldier Louis Barthès, a craftsman before the war, wrote, "They promised us quick victory, but gave us endurance tests instead. I have learned more about human resilience in 8 months here than in all my previous years. The bonds we form with fellow soldiers become stronger than any relationships I had known before. These authentic WWI accounts show us that these were ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, students adapting to extraordinary circumstances and finding meaning in mutual support. Despite the obvious challenges of trench warfare, military leaders continued launching major offensives, believing they could achieve breakthrough victories. July 1, 1916, the Battle of the Somme. Picture General Douglas Haig, British commander, planning from headquarters well behind front lines. He ordered the longest artillery preparation in military history, 7 days of continuous bombardment designed to clear German positions. Haig believed that after this preparation, his forces would advance across no man's land and occupy the cleared enemy trenches. He told his officers this would be a manageable operation. Now picture Tommy representing thousands of British soldiers waiting in his trench at 7:30 a.m. that July morning. He had listened to the week-long bombardment that shook the ground constantly. Tommy's sergeant signaled the advance. Along the British line, signals were given. Tommy climbed his ladder, moved over the protective barriers, and began walking across no man's land with his equipment. He carried 66 pounds of gear and had been instructed to maintain formation and advance steadily. Behind him, 60,000 other British soldiers were following the same orders. However, German forces had survived in deep protective bunkers, 30 feet underground. As British forces advanced across no man's land, German defenders emerged, established their positions, and began defensive fire. By evening, on July 1, 1916, 19,240 British soldiers had been killed and 38,230 wounded. The territorial gain was approximately 300 yards. The Battle of the Somme continued for 141 days. When it concluded in November 1916, over 1 million casualties had occurred on both sides, while the front line had moved less than 6 miles. Verdun, Passchendaele, Ypres, Major Offensive, was planned as the battle that would end the war. Each became a demonstration of both military determination and human cost. At Verdun, the battle lasted 10 months with 700,000 casualties. The French commander, General Robert Nivelle, used the phrase "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. The defensive succeeded, but at enormous human cost. World War I trench warfare affected soldiers' mental health in ways that military medicine was only beginning to understand. Picture Captain John Williams, a Welsh schoolteacher who volunteered in 1915. By 1917, Williams experienced severe hand tremors, sleep disruption, and intense reactions to loud sounds like doors closing or vehicles backfiring. Military doctors called his condition shell shock, initially believing it resulted from artillery concussion. However, Williams actually suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, the mind's natural response to prolonged stress and trauma. Unfortunately, military understanding of psychological trauma was limited in 1917. Some officers interpreted mental health symptoms as lack of courage, leading to court-martial proceedings for some affected soldiers. Yet within this challenging environment, something remarkable developed. Soldiers sharing the same trenches and dangers formed bonds of mutual support stronger than many family relationships. Private Albert Andrews described his trench brothers. In these conditions, you form connections with fellow soldiers that become incredibly meaningful. We shared everything: our last food rations, our hopes, our fears. When Johnson was wounded, I stayed with him and promised to write to his family back home. These relationships taught me that courage is unto the absence of fear. It's continuing to do your duty and support your comrades despite the fear. Modern psychology recognizes this as one of the positive aspects that can emerge from shared, challenging experiences. The extraordinary bonds formed between people who face difficulties together. These relationships often continued long after the war ended. The trenches became testing grounds for military innovations that changed warfare forever. In 1914, soldiers primarily feared rifles and bayonets. By 1918, military technology had evolved dramatically. The Maxim gun capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. Picture Gunner William Mitchell of the British Army, operating his Maxim gun during the Battle of the Somme. In 10 minutes of operation, he could achieve what previous generations of soldiers might accomplish in hours. But Mitchell later wrote about the psychological impact. Operating these weapons changed how we thought about combat. It became more mechanical, more systematic. You learn to focus on the technical aspects: ammunition supply, cooling systems, acquisition, rather than thinking about the human elements. That mental adjustment was necessary for effectiveness, but it also changed you as a person. Artillery became the dominant force on WWI battlefields. Large caliber shells could destroy entire sections of trench systems. The sound of incoming artillery, what soldiers called the freight train, became a defining audio memory for veterans. Artillery presented unique psychological challenges because of its impersonal nature. Unlike small arms fire, which involved direct confrontation, artillery was mathematical and statistical. Soldiers could follow all procedures correctly and still face danger from shells that landed randomly, Lieutenant Charles Hudson explained. Artillery taught us about the role of chance in warfare. Couldn't outfight it or charge it. You could only use proper protective procedures and hope that probability worked in your favor. Chemical weapons represented another technological evolution. By war's end, both sides used compounds that would have been unimaginable to earlier military generations. Phasgen, gas colorless and nearly odorless, it affected respiratory function by causing fluid accumulation in the lungs. Exposure victims often felt normal initially, then experienced delayed symptoms. Mustard gas, known as the king of battle gases, caused delayed chemical burns to any exposed tissue, requiring weeks or months of medical treatment. Captain Harold Gilmore, a Canadian medical officer, wrote, "Treating chemical weapons casualties taught us about the industrial nature that warfare had assumed. These weren't traditional combat injuries, they were the result of applied chemistry and manufacturing. War had become a contest between industrial capabilities as much as military ones. Trench warfare transformed military conflict from individual combat into systematic industrial-scale operations using technology, chemistry, and mass production. Even in the most challenging circumstances, soldiers discovered that shared difficulties create bonds that comfortable peacetime lives rarely produce. Picture Christmas Eve, 1917, somewhere in British trenches near Passchendaele. 5 soldiers share a small dugout. Tommy Morrison from Yorkshire, Sean O'Brien from Ireland, Pierre Dubois, French soldier who had joined British units. During a tactical movement, Hans Weber, German prisoner assisting with construction work, and Ahmed Hassana, colonial soldier from India. Above ground, these 5 represent nations with complex political relationships. Tommy and Pierre are allies. Hans represents the opposing side. Sean serves in forces he has mixed feelings about. Ahmed serves an empire that doesn't always treat colonial subjects equally. But in the trenches, these distinctions matter less. They share their final tin of food. They look at Sean's photograph of his sister in Dublin, who Pierre says resembles someone he knew in France. Hans, speaking careful English, tells them about his family farm in Bavaria and the daily routines he misses. When artillery explodes nearby, covering them in mud, they don't see political enemies or allies. They see what they are: young men far from home, supporting each other through difficult times. Sergeant Robert Graves of the British Army observed, "In trench conditions, nationality becomes less important than immediate human relationships. What matters is whether you share water when someone is thirsty, whether you help carry wounded comrades to medical stations, whether you maintain watch duties so others can rest." The political war happens at higher levels. The personal war in the trenches is about maintaining human dignity and mutual support. This brotherhood often transcended national boundaries. Veterans from opposing sides sometimes maintained correspondence after the war, finding more understanding with former enemies who had shared similar experiences than with civilians who had never served in combat. During quiet periods between engagements, soldiers wrote letters not only to their families but to future generations. To us, many of these letters were discovered years later in equipment, abandoned positions, and personal effects. They represent communications from the past, intended for the future. Private William Peters of the Australian Forces wrote, "If someone is reading this after I am gone, I want you to understand something important. We weren't trying to be heroes. We were ordinary people who found ourselves in extraordinary circumstances. The real heroes are those who returned home and worked to build a peaceful world where such conflicts would be necessary. If you're reading this during peacetime, then perhaps our service contributed to something meaningful." Corporal Michel Rousseau, a French soldier, wrote, "To my future son, your father experienced fear every day for 2 years. I worried constantly and sometimes felt overwhelmed by the situation. I also shared my food with hungry comrades, helped transport wounded soldiers to medical care, and wrote letters for those who needed assistance. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's fulfilling your responsibilities despite being afraid. I hope you never need to learn this lesson through similar experiences." Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, the Canadian medical officer and poet, wrote the lines that became the war's most recognized poem. "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row." Composed these verses after conducting funeral services for his friend Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. McCrae passed away from illness in 1918, but his words became the voice of his generation's experience. November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. Picture Corporal James Sullivan of the American Forces. Positioned in trenches near the Meuse River. He had served in France for 8 months, participating in the Battle of Belleau Wood and Meuse-Argonne offensive. At 22, he felt much older than his years. At exactly 11 a.m., the artillery stopped. It's not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had switched off the entire conflict. Initially, Sullivan doesn't trust the silence. For 4 years, quiet periods had often preceded enemy activity. But this silence continues and spreads across the entire Western Front. Soldiers begin emerging from trenches, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. German and Allied forces stand in no man's land, looking at each other across territory that had been too dangerous to enter for 4 years. Some exchange handshakes, others simply observe, too emotionally exhausted to react strongly. The Great War has concluded. 17 million people have died. 21 million are wounded. Entire communities have been destroyed. A generation of young people has been lost. But Sullivan and millions like him have survived, changed, affected by their experiences, but alive. However, even in that moment of peace, elements that would influence future conflicts were already developing. The trench warfare experience had created not just casualties, but lasting resentments and national grievances that would affect international relations for decades. The peace that began on November 11, 1918, would face significant challenges within 20 years, as unresolved issues from World War I would contribute to future international conflicts. Today, visiting the former Western Front battlefields, you can still observe the historical impact. Areas around Verdun remain dangerous due to unexploded ordnance from 1916. In Flanders fields, poppies continue growing among memorial markers. Row after row of them, cemetery headstones across Europe, bear the names of young people who became soldiers and gave their lives in trenches that have since been returned to agricultural use. But their experiences continue to inform our understanding of military history. Tommy Morrisonauer, representative Yorkshire soldier, survived. July 1, 1916. After being wounded and spending months in medical care, he returned to England in 1919. He married, raised 3 children, and lived to age 84. But the trench experience stayed with him. Every November 11th, he observed 2 minutes of silence at exactly 11 a.m. When his granddaughter asked what he thought about during those moments, he replied, "I remember the soldiers who didn't return home. I appreciate how fortunate I am to be standing in my own garden instead of in a French trench. And I think about how important it is to remember these experiences. Because if we forget what war really costs, we might make similar mistakes again." Tommy's concern proved prescient. 21 years after trench warfare ended, the world would experience an even more devastating conflict. The fighting had stopped, but resolving the underlying issues remained challenging. In our next episode of Untold War Stories, we'll uncover how the Treaty of Versailles to end the Great War planted the seeds for an even greater conflict, World War II. We'll meet Georges Clemenceau, the French leader who wanted to ensure Germany could never again threaten France. We'll observe Woodrow Wilson, the American president who believed he could establish lasting international peace. And we'll see David Lloyd George, the British leader who tried to balance justice with practical considerations. Most importantly, we'll examine how these decisions affected ordinary people, German families during the economic difficulties of the 1920s. French veterans who watched their sons prepare for potential future conflicts, and Americans who initially turned away from European affairs, because the Treaty of Versailles represented not just a peace agreement, but a 20-year pause in international tensions. When those 20 years ended, the world discovered that World War I had been preparation for an even more significant conflict. The story of how peace negotiations became the foundation for future war that's our next exploration of the untold war stories that shaped modern history. This has been Reality of Battlefields. If you found these WWI soldier stories moving, subscribe and join us as we continue to explore the lives hidden behind history's darkest chapters, because to understand our past is to prepare for our future. Thank you for exploring trench warfare with us. Join us next time when we examine how the Treaty of Versailles transformed victory into the seeds of future international challenges.